Every night, as the city drowns in a blanket of neon haze and distant sirens, Studio 7 comes alive. Its soft, amber lights flickering behind soundproof glass like a lighthouse for the lonely. Inside, the most beloved anonymous radio show in the city airs under the name Midnight Heartline. The host is simply known as Vi, a velvet voice, soothing and sincere, whose words feel like a warm blanket on sleepless nights. Her listeners believe she's a seasoned radio personality, maybe in her 30s, with the kind of calm that can only come from years of knowing how to navigate silence. But Vi is actually Lyra, a 27-year-old woman who has never heard a single word she's spoken. Deaf since birth, Lyra doesn't speak in the traditional sense. She doesn't hear the way most people do. What she feels, though, is sound through vibrations, rhythms, and intuition. With a custom-built broadcasting system, adaptive software, tactile feedback gloves, and her own deep empathy, she has created something few could, an emotional voice that transcends hearing. She scripts every word herself, using subtitles and visual cue software to time her pauses and delivery. She monitors vibrations on the console with her fingers to feel her own intonation. And behind the microphone, alone but powerful, she speaks to a world that has never heard her silence. The world responds with affection, flooding the station with emails and messages. But Lyra has always kept a careful distance, her identity, her truth, protected. Until one night, Mira, her only confidant and the station's nighttime producer, slides a crisp envelope across the console. No return address, just the initials JW scrawled in dark blue ink. Lyra opens it curiously, not expecting anything different. But the words inside stop her breath. Your voice has a tremble on the third syllable of the word hope. It cracked last Thursday. Were you crying? I heard it. I just wanted you to know you're not alone. It's the first time anyone has pierced through the veil she so carefully built. Someone had truly heard her, not just the modulation, not just the script, but the sorrow beneath her words. Her hands shake slightly as she rereads the note. How could someone who listens to her voice through a sea of radio static, filtered through a system she doesn't fully hear herself, notice something even she had tried to hide? That night, Lyra finishes her show in a daze. For the first time, she doesn't feel entirely invisible. Someone has found her not by seeing her, but by sensing her. And while she doesn't know it yet, that letter marks the beginning of something far deeper than a voice on the air. It is the start of a silent conversation, a frequency only two hearts can tune into. The letter haunted Lyra for days, not with fear, but with something much more unexpected: recognition. Not many people could hear the kind of detail JW had picked up, let alone interpret it correctly. Most listeners tuned in for comfort, companionship, or late-night lullabies. But JW, he'd heard the waver in her voice, the fracture she thought her filters and scripts had hidden. Somehow, he had found a way to hear between the words. For nights, Lyra kept the letter in her pocket, touching it between breaks like a secret pulse. She debated writing back, but she had no address. Her only option was the airwaves. So, on a Thursday night, during the last segment of the show when most of the city was already asleep, she spoke directly, not to her general audience but to him. To the one who wrote with ink and honesty, you heard right. I was crying. I didn't think anyone would ever notice. It wasn't scripted. Her hands trembled on the console as she said it. She hadn't spoken anything that personal on air before. But it felt freeing. The next night, another envelope arrived. This time, it was longer. I used to be a musician. I lost a piece of my hearing in an accident 2 years ago. Not all of it, just enough to lose pitch. I can still hear, but not like before. I hear the world differently now. I hear what people hide beneath their tones. That's how I heard you. The letter was signed again, JW. Lyra's eyes filled. For the first time, someone outside her small circle understood what it meant to live between sound and silence. Their exchanges began slowly. He'd send a letter every few nights, and she would respond on air with subtle replies woven into her words. She dedicated short poems, played soundscapes she had mixed herself, gentle pulses and ambient waves crafted more with feeling than with hearing. The listeners didn't know. To them, it was just the show evolving, getting deeper, more intimate. But to Lyra and JW, it was a hidden conversation. Through these nightly whispers, she learned more about him. He had once toured as a violinist. After the accident, he withdrew, unable to play without hearing the full spectrum of notes. But he had kept listening to people, to flaws, to the frequency of emotion. And in her, he'd found something that made him stay up past midnight, writing letters to a voice he couldn't fully explain. One evening, Lyra changed her final segment just for him. A question for the stars, she called it. If you could send one message without words, what would it sound like? She didn't expect an answer. But the next letter read, I think it would sound like your breath before you speak. That space. That pause. That's where I feel you most. And just like that, silence became the most powerful language between them. As the letters continued and the nights grew colder, Lyra found herself crafting a new hour in the program, not for the city, but for him. She called it The Pulse. It aired quietly near the end of her broadcast, wrapped in ambient tones, low-frequency vibrations, and whispered field recordings, wind rustling trees, waves lapping against stone, soft pages turning in an old library. She didn't hear these sounds the way others did, but she felt them through resonance, rhythm, and memory. She stitched them together like fragments of a private language. JW responded with a letter the following week. I closed my eyes during the pulse. I heard my grandmother's seaside home in that mix. I don't know how, but I felt like I was 11 again. That wasn't just sound, that was memory. Thank you. Lyra sat in her booth long after her shift ended, staring at the letter with trembling fingers. She hadn't tried to bring anyone back to a place like that. She'd just followed instinct. But something about the way JW felt her soundscapes made her realize they weren't just connecting, they were remembering together. From that night forward, they began an unspoken ritual. Each show ended with a question, just one. A fragment of thought floated into the air like a message in a bottle. What's a sound you miss that no one else remembers? If pain had a tone, what would yours be? Where does silence go when it's shared? JW always responded in letters, not immediately, never rushed. Sometimes it took days. But every letter brought a new truth. Pain sounds like a violin string being tightened too far, right before it snaps. Silence doesn't go anywhere, it stays. But when someone else shares it with you, it stops echoing. Lyra kept every note in a locked wooden box beneath her mixing desk, not because she was hiding them, but because they were sacred. More real than any voice she'd ever heard. The rest of the city still believed Vi was a voice of fiction, a persona, a silky illusion. But Lyra was beginning to realize that, through JW, she was becoming more real than ever. For the first time, her voice wasn't just a mask, it was a bridge. Then, one night, JW's question arrived before she could ask one herself. What would you say if you could see me? Just once? Lyra stared at the paper. She didn't know how to answer. Instead, that night on air, she ended her show with a single minute of nothing. No voice, no music, no static. Just breath. The silence between words. For those who knew how to listen, it said more than language ever could. The night the storm hit the city, it didn't come with warning. An unexpected blackout rolled through just after 10 p.m., knocking out neighborhoods in waves. At Studio 7, emergency lights flickered to life, casting long shadows across the control panels. The tech team scrambled to reboot systems, but the delicate sensory equipment Lyra relied on had gone dead. Her tactile pads, subtitle screen, and feedback gloves useless. Mira urged her to cancel the broadcast. Without the assistive tech, you'll be flying blind. But Lyra shook her head. Not blind, she signed. Just honest. She lit a single desk lamp, pulled the microphone close, and took a breath. No scripts. No sound checks. No filters. For the first time, she spoke not through programming, but through feeling. Tonight, The city has gone dark, she said softly, feeling her throat shape the words. So maybe this hour isn't about sound. Maybe it's about presence. About being here. Still breathing. Still waiting to be found. The rest of the broadcast flowed like a journal entry whispered in real time. She talked about being deaf in a world obsessed with noise. About how silence wasn't absence, but space. Space where things grow, heal, echo. Across the city, thousands listened in candlelight, their devices running on backup battery. Their rooms quiet. JW sat in his apartment, a blanket around his shoulders, eyes closed, head tilted toward the radio. He didn't need perfect signal to hear her. He needed that tremble. The next morning, the mail slot in Studio 7 clicked open. A single letter, slightly damp from rain. You didn't speak tonight, you bled, and I heard every word. It continued. I think I've fallen for someone I've never seen. Someone I've only heard when she stopped trying to speak perfectly. If this isn't just the radio, if this is you, let me meet you. Even once, even if you never speak to me. Just let me look at the girl who made me want to listen again. The letter was unsigned, but it didn't have to be. Lyra read it 3 times, her fingers lingering on the edge of the page. It wasn't a performance anymore. It hadn't been for a long time. She thought of the questions they had sent across the invisible wires. Of the silences shared between syllables. And then, in her smallest handwriting, she wrote her reply. I'll be sitting behind the mic at midnight. Come, if you're real. She sealed the letter, left it with Mira, and returned to the booth. That night, she didn't play music. She didn't prepare notes. She just sat, waiting, for the sound of someone who had already heard her heart before her name. Midnight in Studio 7 was different that night. Not just because the broadcast was stripped to its core, no sound beds, no segments, no callers. But because Lyra wasn't there to be heard, she was there to be seen. The lights were dim, the studio silent, except for the hum of the board coming to life. Mira watched from the hall, nervously holding a thermos of tea she knew Lyra wouldn't drink. She didn't speak. She knew not to. Lyra sat alone, a single letter clutched in her hand, the one she had written, addressed only to a soul who had listened when no one else had. The studio clock struck 12. She looked up. Behind the soundproof glass, the door opened quietly. A man stepped in. Late 20s, tall, with gentle eyes that searched the room, then landed on her. In his hand was a folded envelope, worn at the corners as if read 100 times. Her letter. He didn't smile immediately. He simply looked at her as if taking in every detail was its own language. Then, slowly, he raised his hand. And signed. You were never silent to me. The breath caught in Lyra's throat. Her hand trembled as she reached for the glass, pressing her palm to it. He mirrored her. No words passed between them. Not yet. They stood on either side of the invisible wall, connected by everything they had said without ever seeing each other. Then Mira stepped in, opened the booth door. No fanfare, no dramatic music, just quiet. He stepped inside, face to face, closer now. She could see the scar near his left ear, the kind that spoke of surgery, of loss. His hand hovered in the air again, signing slowly. May I? She nodded. He reached out not to touch, but to hand her the letter. Folded inside was a final message. You were the first sound I felt after silence. Tears slipped down her cheeks. And without rehearsal, without scripting, she answered aloud. You were the first listener I ever believed. They didn't speak much that night. They didn't need to. The city moved around them, trains screeching underground, neon flickering in alleyways. But in Studio 7, there was only stillness. The kind that exists when 2 people no longer need to explain. Lyra would go on broadcasting. JW would return sometimes, quietly helping behind the scenes. Letters would still arrive. But now, they were notes passed across hands, not miles. And every show ended the same. Not with a goodbye. But with a pause. A breath. A shared silence that told the world, you are not alone.